Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event focused on racial biases and artificial intelligence, hosted by the Center for Social Value Creation and Smith Analytics Consortium. Before we get started this evening, I just want to let everyone know that we are recording this event and it will be posted to the Smith School YouTube page. If you have any objections or problems, you can leave this event now. We are so excited to have an amazing panel and group of researchers, academics, and industry professionals share their opinions, their experiences, and their mindsets on racial biases in artificial intelligence. Here at the Center for Social Value Creation, our mission is to educate, engage, and empower Smith students to create a better world through business. We're really excited about the perspectives that are coming with these racial biases and how it is pivotal to ensure as a future industry leader that you're mindful of all the actions that you're taking in the upcoming future. I'd like to pass it off to Wadad Al-Maghrabi at the Smith Analytics Consortium to introduce SAC as well.
Thank you, Nima. I'm excited to see everybody here. As Nima mentioned, I'm Wadad Al-Maghrabi. I'm co-director of the Smith Analytics Consortium. The mission of the consortium is to inspire and facilitate innovation in the realm of analytics by creating a platform where faculty, students, and the larger business community can engage, either through networking events, thought leadership events, or just potentially research collaboration. I'd encourage all of you to visit the Smith Analytics Consortium website. I put the link in the chat. We have a number of events similar to this going forward. The last year we had numerous with our corporate partners, Deloitte and KPMG and Merkle, and we hope to continue to do that this coming year. And in terms of thought leadership events such as this one, we have another one happening on Friday where we'll be having a dialogue with Professor Sinan Aral from MIT on his new book, The Hype Machine, really trying to understand the effect of social media. And just like the Social Value Creation Center, we're really interested and proud to be hosting our panel today. Interested to hear what they're going to have to say. And so I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Lauren Rhue. So I'd just like to give you a very short intro to Lauren. She joined us a couple of years ago. She is an assistant professor in information systems in the Department of Decisions, Operations, and Information Technology. Her research uses empirical and economic methods to explore economic and social implications of technology. Believing technology as a force for positive economic change, she's interested in investigating the economic implications of technology platforms for traditionally disadvantaged populations. I encourage each of you to go look at Lauren's website. I was poking around myself right before this, and the variety of topics in which she's active, whether it's bias, cryptocurrencies, online pro-social behavior, or ethics. It's a rich fodder for the discussion today. And with that, I'll pass it on to Lauren.
Well, thank you so much, Wadad. I was going to talk a little bit about my research interest, but I think that really does sum up what I'm interested in. So I joined Smith a couple of years ago, or I guess last fall, and I'm really always interested in this idea of how can we use business as a force for good. So when I was invited to be on this panel, I was absolutely delighted. I think this issue is so interesting and important, and there's so much that business can really do to think about these issues and to be a force for positive change. I think with that, probably the next thing we should do is hand it over to our panelists. So I'll be your moderator for this session. And we have three wonderful panelists who can speak to biases in their organization, or sorry, not in their organization, but they can speak to this issue of racial bias and artificial intelligence and some of the policy changes, some of the technology changes, and some of the organizational implications of racial bias and artificial intelligence. With that, I'm going to start and hand it over to our first panelist, Jamison Spivak, who is a policy associate at the Center on Privacy and Technology for Georgetown Law. If you could just give a 2-minute introduction to who you are, how you came to be interested in this topic, and what it is that you do.
Thanks, Lauren. So as Lauren said, my name is Jamison Spivak. I'm a policy associate with the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law. which is an independent research and advocacy organization based at Georgetown Law. I have a bachelor's degree in government and politics with a minor in international development and conflict management from the University of Maryland, as well as a master's degree from Georgetown University, where I studied tech policy and ethics. I also worked in communications for a few years before receiving my master's degree. So you could say I've had a pretty circuitous journey to where I got today. The Center on Privacy and Technology, where I now am, looks at how privacy and surveillance policies have disparate impacts on vulnerable and marginalized communities and advocates for policies that reduce these harms. My work specifically focuses on the criminal justice system's use of algorithmic technologies, and specifically predictive policing, face recognition, technology, and risk assessment tools. My goal is to understand how these tools are developed and used, analyze the impacts that they have and the purposes that they serve, and inform the public in order to have robust conversations about them. So I hope that as part of this conversation that we're having today, we can actually expand how we think about bias. Sometimes discourse around bias in technology can focus on kind of narrow definitions of the term. So I encourage all of you to think about how different potential forms of bias intersect, whether it's by race, class, gender, nationality, sexual orientation, religious beliefs, disability, some other classification. And I also encourage you to think about bias not only in data or software, but in wider socio-technical systems. Technology does not occur in a vacuum. It's applied in real life contexts. So how it's deployed, who's deploying it, what purposes, all these things matter. Algorithms are shaped by the social world. And so this context is really important when thinking about bias. And with that, I look forward to diving a little bit more into these issues during our discussion.
Right. Thank you so much. And so when I was doing the prep, that's one thing that came out as well, just this idea of intersectionality, that you have not just race, but gender, location, all class, ableism, all of those things can really intersect. So thank you for bringing that up and talking about wider socio-technical systems. Absolutely. So Jamila Smith-Loud is our next panelist. She is a user researcher at Google's Trust and Safety team. So Jamila, can you talk about your experiences, what you do, and a little bit of background about you?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Jamila Smith-Loud, and my current position is that I lead our research around social impact and human rights. And so as organizations go, I think when my bio was written, I was on another team in a different role, but largely working on similar topics. When I first came to Google, which was 3 years ago, as a company, there was a large focus on ML fairness. And so when I first started, I actually did start working a lot on user research questions. And I will tell you, I come from an applied research background, not a tech research background. So I was like, what is user research? And so I think, lots of learning happened. But when I first started, I was really looking at lots of questions around how do we understand bias in very narrow product specific places, and how do we kind of incorporate user perception, user feedback into how we make those changes at the product level and at the policy level. Our focus as an organization has changed, where we're focusing not just on questions of ML fairness, but also questions on AI ethics broadly. My work is a little bit broader now in that Google released AI principles last year that include a red line about not contravening any kind of UN standards, any human rights standards, which required a lot of proactive assessments of new launches in terms of the rights-based impacts to particularly historic and traditionally marginalized communities, and really ways that we are talking not just about bias as a statistical measurement, but how do we understand kind of community level impacts, societal impacts. And so I think my work now is I say broader in that the questions that I answer are not as product specific, but they are larger questions. So this team that I sit on at Google is called the Ethical ML team, and is part of our larger kind of AI ethics ecosystem. And so we partner a lot with data scientists who are really doing assessments that are very much technical assessments. And our team does a mix of like foundational research on topics that need kind of more information. We partner with academics who are working on projects that kind of intersect with the work we're doing. And then we also do a lot of adversarial testing where we're kind of poking our products to see where they break, almost from like a journalistic perspective. So less from outcome statistical measurement, but like if a journalist was to use this product, what's the type of data set that we could develop to kind of see where it's broken and who it's broken for. So that's kind of in short what I do, but my professional background is that I went to law school, went to graduate school at University of Maryland in the government and politics department, was ABD, which I always, feel a little funny about, but that is the reality. And then after having kids, decided that I was, ready and willing to work in applied research spaces. So worked in applied research in nonprofit settings for many years before coming to Google 3 years ago. So thanks.
Thank you so much. That's such an interesting background and such interesting work that you're doing. And I really loved this point about AI not just affecting individuals. Very often we see a story in the news where someone isn't recognized by facial recognition, but there's really a community and a societal level impact to those products, especially Google, which is international and touches everyone. So thank you. And our last panelist is Carter Price, who's a senior mathematician at RAND. So I'd love to hear more about your background.
Yeah, so I got my PhD from the University of Maryland in the Applied Math program. While at Maryland, I worked with Bruce Golden in the Smith School. So I am very familiar with the Smith School. My brother also got his PhD from the Smith School. Probably, not sure when he graduated, probably 5 years ago. But he's also a graduate of Maryland. And so in terms of, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the RAND Corporation, but we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization. We're one of the oldest think tanks in the country. And, one of the projects that I, at RAND, I am a senior mathematician. I do analytic modeling, data analysis on a whole host of problems. And this is a topic that comes up quite frequently. In particular, I've done work on predictive policing, where one of the things that we assessed was how is it used in practice, and how do people think they should be using it? And then where is the technology capable, or the technology or the techniques capable of actually doing what people want to do with it? And one of the problems in that space is that it does sort of bake in racial bias in a lot of those techniques. And there's also a belief that predictive policing is a magic, magic box that it'll tell you the answer. And particularly, 7 or 8 years ago when we did our first study in this space, that was a widely held belief that there was a lot of hype around what these methods could do, and people were making maybe some unfounded claims about how good their work was, or how maybe useful their techniques were, and there are a lot of problems with bias in those circumstances. I also do a lot of work in healthcare, and that's another place where there's a lot of bias. If you only test drugs on certain populations, then you only know how that they work on certain populations. And in the current environment, the reason we're not doing this in person is because of COVID. And when we talk about responding to testing drugs and things like that, if you don't have an appropriate sample of the population, the drugs that you produce aren't going to work for the appropriate population. So there are going to be problems there. So this is sort of it's highly problematic in the criminal justice system, because that's state sanctioned enforcement of things, but then it's a broader issue. And so happy to thanks for having me, and very, very much looking forward to the discussion here.
Great, thank you so much. And I mean, it's been really interesting to watch that belief in the magic of technology or the magic of artificial intelligence change. I remember teaching a class about the legal and ethical implications of data science, and students believed that an algorithm was objective. So search results are always objective. There's no politics or anything baked into it. And you have to say, well, there's choices that are being made in the technology. So that's really interesting to see how we've moved forward since then. I want to start off with a more general question. What are some of the ways in which your work is trying to combat this issue of racial biases in artificial intelligence, whether it's from a policy level, whether it's from a product level, or any type of larger socioeconomic socio-technical system?
Well, I can say that, with our analysis on predictive policing, one of the things that we recommended was that users be very careful when they are doing their implementation on understanding the biases that are in their initial data. Because if you train on biased data, you're going to get biased results. And also then not to lean too heavily on those technologies, because they are, there's a lot of problems with the data going in those circumstances. And so just really making sure that people are cognizant of those initial biases. I mean, I think that's very important. And then, making sure that policymakers are aware that these biases exist and that that's how these things function. So I think there's a lot of, technological illiteracy, or that might be too harsh, but people don't understand how these technologies work, and particularly policymakers, when you're talking about people that grew up, before computers were common, before the internet, then there might be some challenges there.
Yeah, I think it brings up an interesting point, this question of if the data set is biased, then the artificial intelligence is going to reflect that bias. But then the problem is, how can you balance that, right? There's this idea that if it's accurate, it must be good. But if it's accurate to bias, where do you pull or push that lever to make it less biased? And how do you determine if it's okay or not?
Yeah, I can add in a little bit there, and I think that the position that I'm in is a little bit interesting. I kind of see our team as internal advocates in the company, and so part of our role is to identify where there are potential areas for bias. At a product level, but also at like a process level or a policy level. So it's an interesting, I think, intersection of the question that you're asking, because sometimes the questions, particularly around racial bias, are related to the data set. Sometimes they are very much related to the problem that the product is solving for. It is very much related to kind of the orientation of who's developed this product, who's developed this model, and how they see what the problem they're solving for is. And so I think it's been an interesting question, at least internally, of how do we talk about that in a meaningful way. I think there are, internally, we've developed lots of checks to be able to interrogate data sets. I think what we are kind of growing towards is really being able to lean into interrogating why we're creating things, who's creating that, and whether or not it, solves a problem that needs to be solved by AI. And so I think it's a interesting conversation sometimes to have in technical communities. It's an interesting conversation to have data scientists. And, I'm always pushing that there are probably a conversation that is related to our technical mitigations, and then a conversation that's related to like our more context specific real world mitigations. And that most times both of those conversations are equally important. So, not that I have a good or easy answer, but I do think that that's kind of part of the way, at least in which I interrogate these questions, particularly when I'm very much concerned that there's an issue of bias.
Yeah, that's a great point, that this idea that you have to think about why you're solving the problem and what the context is. I'm sure other organizations don't have the same level of process development that Google has. I mean, it sounds like you've spent years thinking about why you're doing what you're doing in a way to offset this bias. Are there any best practices that other organizations, either smaller organizations or researchers like myself, when you're doing this type of work, how you can think about asking the right questions, both of the data itself, but then also the context?
Yeah, I mean, so I will say that we don't have it perfect and that scale is always an issue at a big organization. You know, there are many more launches than our small team can be involved in. And so the scale issue is something that I think Google, as many organizations, are really trying to manage, particularly in the AI space. I will say that over the last few years, we've spent probably a lot of time in the governance process. So really trying to create an internal infrastructure that tries to catch things, that is doing kind of active issue spotting, that's kind of training product managers and program managers how to issue spot for these issues. So it's a little bit of like having the team that has that expertise, and then how do we kind of reach the most people is part of the process that we are working on and always, you know, working towards. For my own work, particularly in the context of racial bias and bias in general, we really lean in terms of the question of incentives to our existing commitments as a corporation to the UN guiding principles and what we're supposed to be doing under our business and human rights principles. Because I think, you know, questions of bias are hard anywhere, particularly in a corporate space. And so by leaning into, you know, I think for some folks, the conversation that we're having in the AI context seems new and emerging. But when we say that, you know, we already have these existing commitments of what we cannot do, that becomes a, you know, an important part of incentivizing people to really work to get it right. So don't have it all figured out. Couldn't write a treatise on best practices, but I think that those are some of the things that we're working on, just in terms of incentive and in terms of structure.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So if I can go back to the question about looking at racial bias in my own work, I'm building on what Jamila was saying about defining the problem and working on the product. So one of the things that I've been looking at is how in the criminal justice system, the idea of discretion in decision-making, when algorithmic tools are used, it kind of gets obscured. So like the values that underlie decision-making and some of the processes that are used are harder to interrogate or to understand. So an example that I can give you is when a judge is deciding on how to sentence someone. So someone's been convicted of a crime. The judge is trying to determine how to sentence them. And they're weighing different considerations and theories of justice. So is it about preventing that individual from committing a crime in the future, deterring other people from committing the same crime, rehabilitating the offender, punishing the offender, et cetera, et cetera. This is a really complex decision, and it grants the judge a lot of discretion to make a value judgment. But an algorithmic risk assessment tool, on the other hand, it doesn't make this multifaceted calculation. It's relying on inputs of what can actually be quantified and measured, and then that's how they determine how risky someone is, and then that becomes the basis for the sentencing decision in this case. So in this case, only recidivism or rearrest is measured, and therefore only recidivism is inputted as a factor. So the technology is reducing a complex, non-quantitative question into a simpler quantitative one that the technology can answer because it can measure it. And it reinforces a very specific conception of justice. And this is particularly problematic when you consider that recidivism rate itself is impacted by racial bias. Recidivism is the likelihood of being rearrested, and Black and low-income communities are more strictly policed and thus more likely to be arrested. So we're looking at the various ways that bias can be encoded into the technologies, not just in the data, but also in like, how are we defining the problem? How are we measuring it? And what are we building technologies to measure? And how does this perpetuate the status quo? So that's just something that I've been looking at.
Yeah, it's really interesting and very, very valuable work. There's a question in the chat about the research that's out there. And since there's extensive research that's looking in racial bias across a variety of different AI, artificial intelligence contexts, I wasn't sure if any of you would like to speak to either your research or research that's coming out of your areas. Otherwise, I can speak to it.
Yeah, so I can speak specifically on face recognition. It's been well documented by numerous studies that most face recognition systems perform worse on people with darker skin, on women, and on young people, and they perform even worse on when someone is at the intersection of those identities. So particularly if you're a Black woman or a young Black woman, face recognition technology does not work as well on you. And that's been proven by numerous studies, including NIST. So there exists a lot of research to back up this claim.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's facial recognition is one site. There's also research that's looked at lending rates and has shown some issues there. Looking at text. So there's a variety of different various sites for algorithmic bias that have come up. So another question has to do with how do you handle it? Let's say you're at an organization and you realize that there's bias in this tool. What are some of the ways that you can handle that? So we've been talking somewhat about a proactive stance. What happens? What's the reactive position?
I think in those cases, so I can think of an example where we were assessing data essentially on a program and looking at the outcomes and whether there were disparate outcomes from the program. And I think that's sort of the first step, is figuring out, is there bias, and then to what degree is there bias? And then you can try and track down, where did it enter the system? So did it come in from the raw data? Was the data that you fed into it biased, or did the structure of the algorithm, was it, for whatever reason, the utility function or whatever, leading to the bias? And then once you've identified the source, you can figure out, okay, do you need a more balanced data set? Do you need to specifically recruit data points from other areas so that you can flesh out your data set and make sure that it's better representative, or do you actually need to really get in the nuts and bolts of the algorithm, figure out where are the key biases entering into the system? And so it's a non-trivial exercise, but it is well worth it to figure out so that you better understand what you're actually doing. If you just sort of press the button, run your neural net, and then walk away for the day, that's kind of lazy, and you're going to get in trouble at some point. It's not going to work. It's going to break, and you're not going to know why. And so I think those kinds of steps can really help you solve that problem. But then they're frankly useful for all kinds of other issues. And so it's just a useful exercise to go through for lots of reasons.
Great, thank you. So I had a question for Jameson. You do work in privacy, correct? Do you see any overlap between privacy and bias in these artificial intelligence systems in these models?
Yeah, so privacy is something that everyone should be worried about. It's something that concerns everybody, but that doesn't mean that it affects everyone equally. If a lot of people say, if you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't worry about it. But that's coming from a position, a very privileged position that doesn't take into account that not everyone has the same relationship with the government or with law enforcement. And so privacy is particularly important for people from historically marginalized communities. And so the intersection of privacy and racial bias is actually pretty strong, because people that are historically marginalized or currently marginalized have have more to be afraid of. And so in that sense, privacy is very important to those people.
A question from the chat: how is bias identified? When is the red flag raised that there is bias to the point that it's hindering a use case? So it sounds like, for one, there's a measurement question, and this is for all the panelists. How do you measure bias? And then is there a threshold of acceptable bias, and then another threshold above which it's hindering the case, you have to do something about it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess on that end, it's going to depend on your specific use case, but you're going to look at your outcomes, and then if you do have data on race, that's frequently in a lot of use cases that's not going to be part of your data set, and so you'll have to find some other way to figure that out. But if it is part of your data set, then you can look at whether or not you're getting disparate outcomes. There's statistical tests. There are a lot of different techniques you can apply on that end, and then as far as, is it sort of how much is too much, that is going to depend on the use case also. In some cases there are legal thresholds. In other cases, you don't want to be a year out and you write a memo, and then a few years later the memo comes out and says, oh, well, 5%, that's not racist enough, so we're okay. Like, you don't want that memo with your name on it. So figuring out that's sort of an internal deliberation, I guess, as to how much is too much. But usually you want to make sure that the more data your system gets, the better it is. And so hopefully your system is getting better over time, and so that's something you can monitor. So if it's getting sort of, if the bias is growing over time, then that's something you really want to investigate, because eventually it may sort of really get out of hand. And ideally it's narrowing over time, but that's again going to depend on your use case. You want your models to improve over time with the more data. Otherwise, there's something wrong with your approach.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, especially to the point that you don't want your name on the memo. That's setting the threshold around, what's an acceptable amount of bias. But I do think, at least in the context of the work that I do, which sometimes is not specific to a particular type of product or a specific type of domain, those questions are answered within the context of the product and within the context of the use case. I will tell you how uncomfortable I am when anyone asks if there is an amount of statistical bias that is appropriate in some sort of launch. I think that is just, one of those questions that is almost impossible to answer, one from like a moral standpoint, and I think too from just any type of answer is not going to be the right answer. So I think a lot of times those questions are negotiated within the context of that specific domain. And to the question of how do we proactively identify bias, I think like Carter said, sometimes we are doing assessments ongoing of lots of our products, lots of our engagements, and require, even in some of our third-party engagements, that fairness testing is a part of that kind of contractual relationship. In other places, we know that there's a problem because somebody has tweeted it. And so a lot of times for us, those types of public escalations are one, kind of priority setting, and two, unfortunate but really good way for us to know that there's a problem. So I think it's a mix of the things and the systems that we're doing internally, and then there is lots of external pressure and knowledge and watching that happens, that also kind of alerts us to when things are not happening the way that they should.
Yeah. Another question from the chat: when addressing and researching racial bias, how important is it to acknowledge your own bias? Any thoughts on that question?
I think it's extremely important, and that's why it's very useful to have diverse teams. I mean, if I was on a team with just a bunch of white mathematicians, then we would come up with a very narrow set of answers. It's important to have diversity in a whole range of things, and particularly there are things that blind spots I have that it's useful to have other folks that maybe hopefully have, if definitely not the same blind spots, but at least maybe different blind spots. And so that's extremely useful when thinking about these things. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge.
Absolutely. Jamila?
Yeah, I was going to agree with the being able to acknowledge it. And I think one of the things that at least I've noticed over the last few years is there's something about being able to acknowledge there's bias, but there's also something that is important in having kind of multidisciplinary perspectives on how you conceptualize bias. That's been really important. And I think that, you know, the way in which I am oriented to talk about bias and to even see priorities could be very different from someone with a different kind of background, with a different disciplinary background. And so I think that's one of the things that we've really been trying to work against, is like trying to, you know, fight against our own kind of bubble in terms of how we understand not only that there is bias, but how we should prioritize and kind of take action on it. And so, you know, I think even at the higher leadership level at Google, that's one of the things that we're always in conversation about, because it's easy to be around the same group of people and be like, oh yes, you know, there's some different outcomes, but it's not a big deal, or it is a big deal. And I think that is actually where the question of bias appears most, is in how it's prioritized.
Yeah, very interesting point. Just thinking about the legal perspective is different from the ethical perspective, from the actual technical data science perspective.
Yeah, at the Center on Privacy and Technology, we're in an interesting position because we're a think tank, a research organization that's based at a law school, but we also interface with a lot of people in the civil liberties community. So we're kind of playing this balancing role, and we interface a lot with impacted people and people from the communities that are actually being affected by these technologies. So obviously, you know, everyone's going to have their own implicit bias, but hopefully by working with people in other organizations and as part of these communities, it can raise your awareness of your own blind spots that everyone has. And that's really the only way that you're able to do that.
Absolutely, great. So there's another question in the chat about AI governance. So are there published codes of conduct or individual code of conduct? And in general, do you have a thought or perspective on AI governance and how we can also assure this diversity within the groups are central to AI governance?
I would say that one of the areas that I know we've been involved in conversation a lot is probably with the European Commission on AI ethics and their work around that. I think it was the beginning of this year, they released a white paper that was really kind of talking about issues of risk and how corporations should be thinking about it, how governments should be thinking about it, which I thought, you know, I think is interesting. I think, you know, we kind of manage what our expectations are from external governance structures at both kind of a national and global perspective, but even, you know, locally, like in San Francisco, there are very strict laws that recently passed about how things like facial recognition can be used. So I think it's a bit of managing at different levels of geography what the governance expectations are. And then I think, like I said earlier, the concept of what our own internal governance structure is also something that we are always improving on, how things are escalated, whether or not they go through some sort of ethics escalation, whether it's a human right. You know, there are all of these ways in which our internal governance is very much a part of how decisions are made, while also being, you know, super aware of what are the expectations externally. So.
Yeah, the Department of Defense has has spelled out a lot of AI governance issues. They have a lot of documents on that. They, have paperwork for everything. There's also some governance documents related to. I know that the Chinese equivalent of the National Academy of Sciences has a big AI governance report, and so there are a lot of these floating around, and this is an area of active discussion and active sort of policy research, I guess might be the best way to phrase it. So it's definitely an area where people are working and thinking.
Yeah, it seems as though there's a lot of different levels and contexts that are going to influence what exactly the AI governance is. Are we talking about within a corporation? Are we talking about the use? And there's also a question of how you can know. So I've talked with people about, or people have asked me questions rather about hiring technologies and whether or not there's bias there. And one of the questions is getting the data set because people can't see. So to Jamila, what you were talking about before, there's this external pressure, but not every AI tool is public facing. And if that's the case, how do you really get a governance structure or to know what's even happening to get that transparency? So it's really an interesting area of ongoing discussion. One question had to do with bias in thinking about disabilities. So we're pivoting slightly, or pivoting to disability bias. Is there a accepted definition for disability, and what are your thoughts about disability-based bias?
There are legal definitions of disability, and I'm not sure. I'm probably not qualified to talk too much about that. And I know that there are certainly active areas of research on accessibility and how that relates to data collection, and then therefore these data are being fed into AI systems. But I don't know that much about it. I'm not sure if anybody else does.
Yeah, I also don't have specific different definitions, but I think it might be more helpful to not think about it in terms of, does someone have a disability? What is the definition of a disability? And more, how does someone's abilities or disabilities impact what they're able to access or what they're able to do, and how your technology either allows that or excludes them. And that's really going to depend on what the disability is. So it's kind of hard to lump that into one category or definition. It's really so specific to what the technology is, what its affordances are, and how it can potentially be excluding someone.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that in terms of our own internal ethics process, that's definitely a large part of it. And so we kind of have a hub and spoke model where, things come in and then we find the experts either internally or externally that can best help us understand what the impacts. We have a really good team internally that partners with external academics and advocacy groups that is focused on accessibility and making sure that our products are built in a way that they're able to use and benefit from everyone. And so it's just it's part of the process. As all of our processes, they're still developing, but it's definitely part of our process is to include that as part of our general ethics review.
Great, thank you. So there are a couple of different questions that are coming together, and one was talking about a specific example to anchor the conversation, and so that might be a good place to start. So there's a paper that came out in Science last year. It was covered in the Washington Post, and it talked about a healthcare setting. There was a model that was run to predict healthcare spend, and it was delivered to the client. The client then used that to prioritize different healthcare patients. And when that data was given to researchers, they found that the system prioritized affluent white patients above lower income Black patients, and it was consistent. And and what they realized is because it was optimizing for spend, there are income and cultural reasons why Black patients are less likely to use the hospital, and therefore the model predicted that they were less sick when in actuality they were as sick or sicker. So that is an example of how you have this racial preference that emerges in various places. It emerges in the data itself. It happens when this model was used and was developed for one context and used in a different context. And then this was actually deployed across hospitals and touched millions of different individuals. So that's an example of it. The question is it possible to build systems that first screen for these trends before they end up being launched? And then a related question is, how do you ensure this technology can unlearn these types of biases?
That one I think is an interesting example and use case that I've thought about a lot. And it's, I think, a really interesting example of why even in the model development process, you need a multidisciplinary approach. So I imagine that if you knew that you were asking a question that was related to how do you allocate resources, if you had someone who was both a data scientist and someone as a part of that group who was really an expert in health equity, you would, because what we know at the root of health equity those are access and resource questions. And so if you are solving for a problem that is around resourcing or access, you have to get the expert in the room who can help you optimize on the appropriate data set. It may have been that that's a question where if they had got all the appropriate people in the room, they had made a whole different decision about whether or not this is a model can answer this question appropriately, whether or not there is even existing data to answer that question. I think that if you had the right people in the room at the problem formation phase, you would probably either not have that model because that data, the appropriate data, would have been much harder to get, or you would have optimization at a different variable. So I think it's a super interesting one that we've talked about a lot internally, because I think it raises questions all along the model process. And so I think when we talk about fairness and when we're assessing for fairness, we're really thinking, sometimes people are like, at what point of the process do we intervene? And that's an example where you can kind of see where the holes were at all parts of the process. So.
Yeah, I can think of a related example for a study that we conducted where we were looking at the social determinants of health as it pertained to Medicaid usage. And one of the things that we found was that when you look at homelessness, homeless people use a lot less healthcare than the population in general, or than sort of their peers. And when you account for other risk factors and stuff, and that is almost certainly a factor of access to care. And that was something that wasn't something that ideally what we, that was something we found after we did the analysis, but identified it. And so we were able to mitigate it after the fact. But sort of going into that, a better approach for us would have been to, one, sketch out what the possible outcomes might be, typically you lay out your expectations. So these are my priors. This is what I think these relationships should look like. And then if they don't, then figure out why. Now, when you lay out those priors, that may bake in your biases. So you have to be very careful there. And that's why working with an interdisciplinary team is very important. One of the things at RAND that we do, my training is in math, is in applied math. I am woefully uninformed about history. I've been trying to correct that, but that's not my strong suit. And so I work with sociologists. I work with historians. I work with people that have these backgrounds and that can help me learn. And coming in, if you're the technical person on the team, be humble and listen to what the subject matter experts have to say, because you're there to do the math and to crunch the numbers and to come up with the best, algorithmically, the best way to do it. But when someone says that, this is a population that has these characteristics and you need to be careful about that, listen to them and then think about how you can adjust that. And then on the back end, the way we corrected it was we essentially looked through and figured out, what were the possible explanations for the findings that we had, and then talked with some experts, looked at the literature, and were able to identify it on the back end. And so that was a case where knowing that on the front end, I'm not sure what we would have done differently. It just would have been better to know it on the front end. So that it's definitely a problem, and working with people that have different perspectives is very useful in these situations.
Yeah, so on the question about screening data for bias, I'll say that even if you could theoretically detect and correct bias in the data, you also still need to think about how what you're building fits into the larger context, as we've been saying. You need to think about how the technology is going to be used. So as I mentioned before, most face recognition systems perform worse on people with darker skin, particularly when they're women. So improving this technology so that it performs equally for all skin tones, it seems reasonable. But you also have to keep in mind that face recognition is a tool that's going to be used primarily on heavily policed neighborhoods, which tend to be communities of color for surveillance purposes. So by making the software less racially biased, you're also perfecting a tool of surveillance that will be disproportionately used on racial minorities. So think about what aspects of the status quo you see as unjust, and how even a neutral algorithm that might be race blind or might be fair or unbiased might perpetuate a status quo that is unjust. So Black and low income communities are policed more and more strictly due to systemic racism and social inequities that drive crime rates. And a predictive policing algorithm that's based on historical crime data will reinforce this pattern. So labeling a certain neighborhood as high risk means more police are sent there, more time spent in the neighborhood means police witness more crime there, make more arrests. It just further fuels this designation as a high risk area. So even if you control for race or proxies for race in your algorithm, the existing social inequities of the broader system into which the algorithm is being placed can lead to biased outcomes.
And one about improving, how do you get your stuff to improve over time, or to answer that angle on the question. One way you can do it is if you know you have some data that's sort of from a bad era, or that was initially biased. If your data are getting better in terms of they're getting less bias over time, then you can weight the newer data or the less biased data more, and so you can set your algorithms up such that they're maybe they still remember some of the older data, but that's being underweighted over time. And so there are a lot of techniques like that from an implementation standpoint that you can think about adding. And so there are ways you can treat your data as it's fed in, or sort of pre-process your data to work on that. That's not going to work in all situations. That'll work in some situations. And so that's something that familiarizing yourself from a practitioner standpoint, familiarizing yourself with these approaches, different weightings, different ways of handling those data. That's one way to go about it.
Okay. Well, I just want to be mindful of the time. Thank you all so much. It's 6:57 and our panel is supposed to wrap up at 7. I wanted to give you each a chance to share one final thought with the audience on anything related to this topic. So Carter, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I think this was a very interesting discussion. And I think the one thing I can impart is, work on diverse teams if you can, and try and be very cognizant about what you don't know, and come at things, as humble as you can and with as much of an open mind as you can, because particularly from a practitioner standpoint, from a mathematician standpoint, or an analyst standpoint, a lot of times you don't know what you don't know, and that's really gonna trip you up. And so focus on what you know, but then listen to other people and try and learn over time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great.
I also, thank you all for including me in this conversation. One of the things that I thought about as you all were talking about the prior question is, one of the things we've been doing internally are these things called model cards and data cards, which are basically like similar to a nutrition label, but ways in which to open up a model to be able to understand more about what's going on, how the data was optimized, and it's really a goal towards transparency and accountability. So I just thought that, you know, it's an interesting project in its kind of early stage, but it's really a way for us, even as folks who may not be the builders of the model, to understand what's going on so that we can interrogate it differently. And then the thing that I think that is just most important in the context of this conversation, particularly in this current climate, is really trying to prioritize questions about context as the most important question of how you assess impacts, how you assess whether things are going to work, whether it should be built. I think sometimes things are like, we have this data, let's build it. And you know, it's like, we have a hammer, let's fix something. And really trying to think about the context has been really, I think, important in my work, but just important in conversation to kind of get good answers and good results.
Yeah, I'll plus one that. And yeah, thanks for having me. And you know, these conversations are super important. I would also encourage people to think about other harms as well that result from AI, that even if we could magically get rid of bias, would still exist. For example, how does a given technology change a balance of power between police or between the government and civilians, between large tech companies and consumers? Ask questions like, how are historically marginalized communities impacted by the technology, even if it's quote unquote, you know, unbiased? How does technology embed certain values into decision-making processes? How does it make it harder to challenge them? And do certain technologies cut off other potential solutions to the problems we face? So those are the kinds of questions I hope you ask yourselves. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it over to Nima and Widad.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending our event this evening. It was just such an exciting discussion about racial biases and artificial intelligence. If you'd like to learn more about the Center for Social Value Creation or the Smith Analytics Consortium, our two websites are included at the bottom of the chat. We both have exciting events coming up in the next week, so feel free to connect, let us know more, and thank you so much, Lauren, Jamila, Carter, and Jameson, for your time this evening. We truly appreciate you giving us your insight, your brain space, and giving our students and our greater Smith community this feedback. This recording will be sent out by the end of the week to all participants and posted on the Smith School YouTube page as well. So thank you so much for your evenings and have a great night.